We now focus on the continuous responses that we are getting and expectation from analysts around the medium-term budget policy statement, and that's where the socio-economic matters of this country are expected to be high on the agenda. The balancing act expected from the mini-budget tomorrow is between spending, trimming debt and providing social grant relief. The statement to be delivered by the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana comes at a time when consumers are battling the high cost of living, and this is due to the rising inflation and the impact of load shedding on individuals and businesses. TPN Credit Bureau's Waldo joins us now for this conversation. Waldo, welcome.
Good morning to me and good morning to your viewers.
Of course, we do need to speak about how South Africa is going to spend, particularly on the better than expected tax revenue, and how becomes quite critical, looking at the dynamics of the economic landscape, a struggling consumer, as well as a need for social grant relief.
You're very correct, and I think the Minister is going to put a lot of focus on the improved tax collections. But we have to be very cautious to understand that this is short-lived, or potentially short-lived. It comes from SARS being more efficient in collections. We're looking at improved commodity prices that really benefited South Africa, especially in the first 2 quarters of this year. So there's definitely going to be an emphasis on that. However, as we expect the global economy potentially heading into a recession, including ourselves, there's going to be less demand for these commodities, and therefore we're expecting a little bit of a decrease in terms of tax collections. What we are looking at towards the Finance Minister specifically is how are we going to look at failing state entities like Eskom and Transnet, and how is he going to fund these? We need to see Eskom receiving its improvements in terms of balance sheet so that they can continue building more capacity, which is desperately needed, not just for businesses but also for consumers and international confidence.
Speaking of international confidence, what balance should be struck here to impress the likes of rating agencies, at least to give South Africa some sort of reprieve here?
Well, I think the key focus would be as how much funding would be allocated to fight corruption. We run the risk of being grey-listed, and at that point we're going to definitely see an outflow of investment. So there's going to be a very, very key focus around what is being allocated to fund corruption in South Africa. I think the second one is just to show that we are reducing our debt. We understand that we have to reduce our expenditure from a government perspective, and that might include grant reliefs and how that is balanced in terms of potentially a slowdown in tax revenue.
We must also then dive into how South Africa is expected to deal with its debt and its burdens in that regard.
Oh yes, definitely, and I think post-COVID, we have seen, due to the increase in commodity prices and our exports, has benefited South Africa in terms of our trade deficit. But as we become more reliant on importing, especially fuels, it's going to be very, very difficult to balance these things out.
We know that the MTBPS is more of a policy statement and a reminder of what South Africa has spent in its fiscal purse between the February budget and now. But currently, we are in a situation where the high cost of living has become a matter of concern and pressuring the ordinary consumer. Is there anything that's expected to come out from the Finance Minister with regards to how the South African consumer can be cushioned?
Well, I think the positive is that we've seen a slowdown in the headline inflation, 7.6% in August, a slowdown to 7.5%. That means that we are cautiously expecting a slowdown in the interest rate hike cycle. It's not necessarily going to be as aggressive as what we've experienced in the previous quarters. However, the consumer remains under huge pressure. We've seen it in our data from a TPN perspective, where both businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, are really struggling to make their rental payments. And then, of course, the consumer from paying their residential rental, the lower end of the market is really battling. So as we see inflation hopefully kind of stabilizing, that the consumer would be able to say, all right, I can move forward, and hopefully that we don't see new surprises around fuel prices. But usually the midterm budget is more about, as you mentioned, a reflection. We do expect definite mentions around the relief grants, how that will be impacted. And then, of course, I think more from a motorist perspective, we are quite interested to hear what they have to say around the e-tolls, especially in Gauteng.
Of course, the e-tolls kind of ruffle feathers when we speak of them, but on the side of inflation in South Africa as well as interest rates that you touched on a short while ago, what should the minister then be saying, particularly when it comes to showing support for the Reserve Bank, which has for quite some time has sought to remind South Africans that the interest rate hiking cycle is still at a level that is moderate and feasible for an economy such as South Africa?
Well, I think the emphasis should be placed on the balance, of course, of maintaining a balance between the monetary and fiscal policies of South Africa, and the importance of maintaining inflation. I think there needs to be an acknowledgement around that a lot of our inflation is imported. It's not necessarily created due to high demand or an overstimulated economy. Most of our imports, especially from the Northern Hemisphere, has seen dramatic increases. The energy crisis that Europe is experiencing due to the war in Ukraine is filtering down, and we can see it just in our diesel prices. And of course, diesel prices impact the transportation across South Africa, especially on foods. And that once again highlights the importance of understanding how the minister is going to look at financing infrastructure that is in desperate need of maintenance and expansion. For Transnet, for instance, we desperately need this state-run enterprises to work for the economy, to work for the consumer, so that we don't have to rely on, for instance, the Reserve Bank to drop inflation for us.
Thank you, as always, for your insights. That's TPN's Waldo talking to us about those expectations ahead of the medium-term budget policy statement. And